Noah called upon us, and how excellent was our response. We delivered him and his family from great distress.
I mean, it sounds exactly like the classic ending to a mythological bedtime story, right?
Yeah.
A hero in deep trouble, a desperate plea to the heavens, and then, poof, a miraculous physics-defying rescue from the sky.
It really does. But we are definitely not doing bedtime stories today.
No, we are not.
Today, this deep dive is pulling from the really extensive, highly analytical works of the 20th century thinker Allama Parvez. And our mission here is to look at two of the oldest, most heavily mythologized stories in human history, the accounts of Noah and Abraham.
Right, and we're going to completely strip away the magic, the myths, and the supernatural interventions.
Exactly. We're looking at the actual structural blueprint of human survival, the systemic cause and effect that's just hidden underneath these ancient texts.
Which is, I mean, that's a profound paradigm shift. To give you some context on our course material today, Allama Parvez was a rationalist scholar. He looked at the Quran not as a book of mystical spells or, supernatural history, but as a socio-political, economic, and fundamentally rational framework.
Yeah, a completely different lens.
Totally. He argued that the laws of nature, physics, thermodynamics, human psychology, sociology, those are the divine laws. Therefore, a true miracle or divine response isn't a violation of those physical laws. It is the ultimate perfect alignment with them.
And that just completely shatters the fairy tale reading of the quote I opened with, because we are looking at Surah As-Saaffat, verse 75, which details this excellent response to Noah.
Right.
And Parvez argues this passage is actually the foundational blueprint of how a rational system, like the universe itself, responds to human action. It establishes the mechanics of cause and effect.
Yeah, it forces us to ask a very uncomfortable fundamental question. What actually distinguishes a call for help that the system responds to from a call that just, echoes endlessly into the void?
I want to really dig into that contrast because Parvez draws it so vividly in the source material. You have this impending doom, right? A massive environmental collapse, a flood.
A literal catastrophe.
Yeah. And the typical irrational human response to a crisis like that, even today, is to freeze and just wait for a miracle. The text brings up this incredible tragic anecdote of modern people during times of severe drought or catastrophic flooding, literally climbing onto the roofs of their houses just to shout prayers into the sky.
Which is heartbreaking, really.
It is. They are entirely sincere in their plea, but they're asking the physical world to change its state without them putting in any physical material effort.
Right. It is the ultimate psychological abdication of responsibility. You stand on your roof as the water rises, you make your verbal plea to the universe, and you just assume the burden of action has now been successfully transferred to an invisible power.
Like it's out of your hands now.
Exactly. You expect the laws of fluid dynamics to simply pause because you asked nicely. But if we look closely at Parvez's reading of the text, the excellent response to Noah wasn't a magical evaporation of the floodwaters. The system didn't violate its own laws of gravity to save him.
No, the response was an imperative. The response was build an ark.
That is the core of it right there. The response is a command to manipulate matter.
But, okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because I can hear someone listening to this and thinking, well, isn't the whole point of a supreme being or a universal intelligence that it can break the rules?
Sure, that's the standard assumption.
Right. So why is the excellent response just telling a guy to do a massive amount of manual labor?
Because if the system breaks its own rules, it ceases to be a reliable system. Parvez's argument is that the rationality of the universe is absolute. If water is gathering at a certain volume and velocity, it will destroy human flesh and bone.
It's just math.
It is a permanent truth. The rational system's excellent response to a looming physical disaster isn't an invisible shield. The response is the urgent, sudden realization in the human mind that you must construct physical defenses. Dams, bridges, ships.
Oh, wow. So the intervention is the blueprint itself.
Exactly. The intervention is the sudden awareness of the cause and effect that governs your survival. The system only responds when a messenger aligns with physical laws. The call for help itself has to activate the correct material conditions.
So it's not a passive thing at all.
Not at all. If you are standing in the path of a tidal wave, the universe's answer to your cry for salvation is the adrenaline and the instinct to run to higher ground. In Noah's case, the society was facing a systemic collapse, and the response was the foresight, the engineering and the socioeconomic mobilization to build a massive vessel long before the first drop of rain even fell.
Which means, bringing it back to that anecdote, if you're just standing on your roof shouting to the clouds, you haven't actually understood the system at all.
You've completely missed it.
You are waiting for an intervention that will never come, because the intervention already happened. It was the blueprint you ignored. You ignored the civil engineering, you ignored the climate data, you ignored the structural warnings.
And this fundamentally redefines what a messenger is in this rational context. A messenger of reason isn't someone who wears glowing robes and casts spells.
Right, no magic wands.
Right. A messenger is someone who reads the environment, understands the impending material consequences of the society's trajectory, and implements the physical, structural solution.
They are the ultimate pragmatists.
They have to be. And the profound tragedy of the Noah narrative is the social dynamic that occurs while that pragmatism is being executed. Noah is building this enormous ship, following the rational blueprints, sweating, cutting wood, organizing logistics, and the rest of the society is just walking by, mocking him.
Because to them, the sky is clear.
Exactly. They think he has lost his mind.
They aren't reading the systemic signs. They don't see the long-term chain of cause and effect. They just see a guy doing grueling, seemingly pointless, hard labor for no immediate reason.
It looks ridiculous to them.
It really makes me think of people today who mock scientists warning about systemic risks. Whether it's ecological, financial, epidemiological, people mock it because the disaster hasn't literally broken through their front door yet.
That is the exact modern parallel. The irrational society operates purely on immediate visual feedback. I don't see rain, therefore the ship is a joke.
Yeah.
But the rational mind operates on systemic trajectory. The conditions for rain are escalating, therefore the ship is the only logical reality, regardless of what the sky looks like today.
Right.
And when the flood finally does come, the people who relied on irrationality, who mocked the preparation and didn't build the ark, are swept away.
And crucially, Parwez argues they aren't swept away because of some personalized emotional vengeance from the heavens, right?
Not at all. There is no anger from the sky. They are destroyed simply because they failed to engage with the material reality of their environment. Gravity and fluid dynamics did what they always do.
Yeah, water behaves like water.
Exactly. Noah and his group survived purely because they engineered their survival according to those exact same laws of nature. The water that drowned the irrational society is the exact same water that provided buoyancy to the rational society ship. The difference wasn't the water. The difference was the preparation.
The material conditions were identical, but the human alignment with those conditions was different. Okay, so Noah and his community survived the immediate physical threat. They ride out the flood. But that raises a much bigger question, and it's where the source material takes a fascinating turn.
Yeah, it does.
If the ark was the physical salvation from the immediate flood, there's a critical transition that has to happen next. You survive the water, but how do you survive time?
The problem of continuity.
Exactly. How does the group keep going across generations? This brings us to the next vital line in the source text we are analyzing. We made his descendants the ones who endure.
Now, if you approach that sentence with a conventional, traditional mindset, you immediately think of genetics. You think of biological lineage, bloodlines, family trees. You assume it means Noah's literal biological children inherited the earth.
Which is how almost everyone is taught the story.
Right. But Parwez's reading strips that biological assumption away entirely. He argues fiercely that this passage is absolutely not about genetic lineage. In a rational framework, a biological bloodline doesn't guarantee the endurance of a society.
No, definitely not.
History is a graveyard of powerful genetic dynasties that collapsed because they became irrational, corrupt, or just lazy.
So if it's not a genetic lineage, what kind of descendants are enduring?
It is an intellectual lineage. It is the lineage of an idea. The text is saying that the community of people who accept this rational model of cause and effect, the people who understand that you must build this ship before the rain comes, and who pass that methodology forward, they are the ones who persist.
That's almost like open source software.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, you aren't the descendant of the original creator because you happen to share their DNA. You're the descendant because you downloaded the code, you maintained the servers, you patched the bugs, and you kept the network running for the next generation.
That is a brilliant analogy. Genetic survival is passive. You inherit your DNA whether you want to or not. It requires zero effort on your part. But intellectual survival, maintaining the open source code of a rational society that requires continuous, grueling, conscious effort.
You can't just coast on it.
No, you have to actively choose to adopt the rational framework every single day. You have to actively teach it to the next generation. You have to actively choose to build the ship.
That is a massive paradigm shift for how we view historical legacy. It means that every single community or society or even an individual listener tuning into this deep dive right now who applies reason, who audits their environment, and who prepares structurally for the future is the descendant of Noah.
Yes.
You don't need a DNA test. If you understand the laws of cause and effect, you are the heir to that legacy.
And to ground this in a very tangible, real-world consequence, the source material gives a fantastic example involving the concept of sustenance. In almost every major theological tradition, there is this overarching promise that the universe or the system or God provides for humanity. That sustenance is a guaranteed baseline.
Right, like the whole look at the birds of the air, they neither sow nor reap, yet they are fed. That kind of sentiment. But then you look at the actual physical world and half the globe goes to bed starving.
Exactly.
So how do you reconcile that? Is the system lying? Is the promise broken?
Well, the irrational mind looks at global starvation and says one of two things. Either, yes, the promise is broken and the universe is cruel, or we just need to pray much, much harder for food to literally drop from the clouds. They go back to standing on the roof, shouting at the sky.
But the rational mind, the intellectual descendant, sees it completely differently.
The intellectual descendant understands that the system does not and will never drop baked bread from the stratosphere. That violates the laws of physics and agriculture.
Right.
The promise of sustenance is fulfilled strictly and exclusively through the actions of a conscious, reasoning community.
They act as the hands of the system.
Precisely. The Earth has enough arable land, enough water, and enough thermodynamic energy from the sun to feed everyone. The system has provided the raw materials. But if a community wants to see that promise realized, they have to build equitable agricultural systems.
They have to do the work.
Yeah, they have to engineer robust supply chains. They have to design economic structures that prevent hoarding and distribute resources efficiently. If they do that, everyone is fed and the system's promise is fulfilled.
The system provides, but it provides through the collective action of those intellectual descendants.
Yes, and the terrifying flip side of that equation is that if that reasoning community is absent, or if they fail to build those supply chains, the promise remains entirely unfulfilled in the physical world. Parwes is uncompromising here. Starvation is not a divine test or a mystical mystery. Starvation is the direct mathematical result of a society failing to act as the hands of the rational order. It is an engineering failure. It is an economic failure.
So if you want the system to save you from hunger, you have to do the work of the system. You have to be the descendant who actually swings the hammer, plants the seed, and drives the supply truck.
That collective physical effort is what allows a society to endure time. That is what it means to be the descendants who persist.
Okay, I love this, but I want to pivot slightly because Noah had a community. He had a family. He had people willing to swing the hammers with him to build that massive structure.
He wasn't totally alone.
Right, but that assumes the environment you are in actually allows you to build. What happens when the society is so deeply, toxically entrenched in its irrationality that the moment you try to build an ark, they burn your wood?
That is the big question.
What happens when that collective reasoning just doesn't exist and you are entirely alone?
That forces us to look at the isolated messenger. And that is exactly where the source material takes us next, transitioning from Noah to the figure of Ibrahim, or Abraham.
Right. If Noah's story is the blueprint for communal salvation and collective preparation, Ibrahim's story is about the ultimate individual intellectual confrontation. It's one person standing up and auditing a deeply violently irrational society.
Parwes refers to this conceptually as the idol audit, and it is a masterful way to frame societal critique.
Let's break down this idol audit, because Ibrahim looks at the belief system of his father, which is the foundational belief system of his entire civilization, and he doesn't start by throwing punches. He asks a deceptively simple, probing question: what are you worshiping? These carved images, are these what you worship?
Yeah, it's so direct.
Parwes views this not as some physical gladiator battle against statues, but as the fundamental critical act of any rational system. You have to audit the idols.
We really need to pause and unpack why asking the question, why are you worshiping this, is far more devastating to a society than just walking into a temple and smashing a statue with a hammer.
Yeah, why is that? Because visually, smashing the idol feels like the ultimate victory, right? You destroy the physical object of their irrationality.
It feels like a victory, but it's strategically useless. If you smash the idol, you haven't destroyed the underlying belief system. You've just made a martyr out of a piece of stone.
Oh, that makes sense.
The worshippers will simply sweep up the rubble, carve another statue, probably twice as big, and they will guard it with lethal force. You haven't cured the disease, you've just aggravated the symptoms. But if you force the worshippers to explain the logic of their devotion, you strike at the psychological root of the entire civilization.
You're forcing them to vocalize the absurdity. You're making them hear their own irrationality out loud.
Exactly. Because an idol is fundamentally dead. It is inert matter, whether it's a literal carved statue of wood in the ancient world, or a modern idol, like a prestigious job title, a toxic corporate culture, an arbitrary social hierarchy, or a social media algorithm. The idol itself has zero inherent power.
It can't actually do anything.
Right. It cannot feed you, it cannot think, it cannot move. It only has power because the human mind voluntarily projects power onto it. It is our psychological submission to the idol that brings it to life.
Oh, that is incredibly relevant. If you're listening to this on your morning commute, think about your corporate hierarchy. We treat things like the algorithm or the Q3 earnings report or the vice president title like ancient people treated the sun.
We really do.
Like these untouchable, all-powerful gods that dictate our entire existence and self-worth. Doing an idol audit today means sitting down and asking if that corporate ladder is actually a fundamental law of physics, or if it's just a collective social construct that you and everyone else have simply agreed to submit to.
That is the perfect modern translation of what Ibrahim was doing. The moment you stand up, step back, and apply cold, hard reason to the idol, the psychological projection breaks. The godhood vanishes.
It just disappears.
The terrifying deity shrinks back into a piece of rock or a string of digital code or a completely meaningless man-made social construct.
Ibrahim is trying to break that psychological projection. And the source text gives us an absolute masterclass in how he executes this audit, starting with his observations of the celestial bodies. Because his society didn't just worship carved wood, they worshiped the stars, the moon, the sun.
The big ones.
Yeah, these were the ultimate untouchable idols of the ancient world.
And you can understand why. From an ancient, irrational perspective, the celestial bodies are massive, they are untouchable, they dictate the seasons, and they seem permanent. But Ibrahim doesn't just bow down to them. He essentially applies the scientific method. He observes them over time.
He watches them, he logs the data.
Yes. He observes a core principle of physics, which in Arabic is called tukhayar.
Tukhayar. What does that translate to in this context?
It translates to change, alteration, or transition. Ibrahim watches a star rise in the night sky, shine brightly, and then inevitably set. It disappears. He watches the moon do the exact same thing. It goes through phases, it wanes, it vanishes. He watches the sun, the biggest, most domineering idol of them all, command the sky for a few hours, and then inevitably sink below the horizon, plunging the world into darkness.
And his conclusion from this data gathering is brilliant. He says if it rises and sets, if it is subject to change, if it is forced to move by a system larger than itself, it cannot be the supreme, unyielding truth. It is just a gear in a much larger machine.
He announces to his people, I do not love things that set. It is one of the most profound, deeply rational statements in ancient literature.
It's so poetic, too.
It is. What he's really saying is, I do not worship entropy. If something is bound by the laws of thermodynamics, if it experiences tughayar, if it is subjected to forced movement and change, it is a subject, not a ruler. You cannot worship the changing variable.
Right.
You can only align yourself with the unchanging, invisible laws that govern the change.
But wait, let me jump in here. Did Ibrahim literally, personally believe the sun was a god for a minute there and then change his mind when it set? Or was he playing a rhetorical game with his society to prove a point?
Parwez strongly leans toward the latter. Ibrahim was intellectually awake. The text portrays him walking his people through the scientific method out loud. He is saying, okay, let's assume your premise. The star is a god. Wait, the star just disappeared. A god doesn't disappear.
Right, checking the hypothesis.
Exactly. Okay, let's try the moon. The moon is a god. Wait, the moon just vanished too.
Yeah.
He is using their own observable reality to dismantle their worldview piece by piece.
He's not bringing down mystical, glowing scrolls from a mountaintop. He's literally just pointing at the sunset and asking, does that look like an all-powerful being to you?
Exactly. He is trying to shock them into rational thought. But here's where the source material dives into one of the most fascinating and controversial reinterpretations of the entire Parwez framework, we have to talk about the metaphor of the four birds.
Yes. This is where Parwez's structural lens completely rewrites centuries of accepted theology. Let me set the stage for you, the listener, who might be familiar with the traditional myth. The story that gets passed down through generations is this very literal, highly magical event.
Very magical.
Ibrahim is asking how a dead society can be brought back to life, or how the dead are resurrected. And he is supposedly instructed by God to take 4 different types of birds, slaughter them, chop them up into a literal minced meat mixture, scatter the bloody pieces on 4 different mountaintops, and then call out to them.
Right.
And magically, the minced meat flies together through the air, reassembles into living birds, and flutters back to his shoulder.
Which, if you apply the rational, systemic lens we've been using for the past 40 minutes, makes absolutely no sense.
It violates the very laws of cause and effect that Parwez says are the divine laws. It turns a profound lesson in sociopolitical engineering into a cheap parlor trick.
It does. It reduces the rational order of the universe to a magic show.
Right. So I have to ask, wait, hold on. You can't just edit out the most famous part of the story. Centuries of theological traditions say the birds were physically slaughtered and brought back to life. Is Parwez just cherry-picking translations to fit a secular, modern worldview? How does he justify ignoring the literal text?
He isn't ignoring the text at all. He is deeply interrogating the linguistics of the text. Parwez points out that the operative Arabic word used in this specific passage is surhuna.
Surhuna.
Yes. Over centuries, commentators influenced by external mythologies translated surhuna to mean slaughter or chop into pieces. But if you go back to the classical Arabic roots, surhuna does not mean to slaughter. It means to incline them towards you, to tame, to habituate.
Oh, wow. So it's not a butchery manual. It's about bird training.
It is an extended analogy about the grueling process of taming wild birds, which represents the process of trying to civilize, educate, or awaken a wild, irrational, dead society.
That makes so much more sense.
Ibrahim is looking at his people, who are completely intellectually dead. They are entirely feral in their irrationality, worshipping statues and stars. He essentially asks the system, how do I bring this dead nation back to life? How do I get an irrational mob to respond to reason?
And the system's response is, look at how a master bird trainer works.
Exactly. Let's break down the mechanics of that metaphor because it answers the how of societal change. If you want to tame a wild bird, you don't use magic. You don't yell at it. And you certainly don't chop it into pieces. What do?
You have to use immense, almost agonizing patience. You have to condition it.
You offer it a safe environment. You provide food. You spend time with it day after day, week after week. You have to slowly, meticulously align its wild survivalist instincts with a new, structured reality.
Earning its trust.
Exactly. You let it get used to your voice, your movements, your presence, until the fear dissipates and trust is established.
You are systematically altering its psychology.
Yes. And eventually, after an enormous amount of consistent, exhausting effort, you can open the cage door. The bird can fly out into the open sky, totally free. But when you call it, because of the conditioning and the trust you've built, it will willingly fly back and land on your shoulder. Not by magic, not through a supernatural violation of physics, but through the deeply rational laws of behavioral habituation.
That is such a powerful, heavy metaphor for leadership and societal reform. It completely shifts the burden of resurrection from a divine magic trick in the sky down to the very real, very exhausting, unglamorous work of human education.
That's real work.
It means if you want to wake up a dead society, or change a toxic corporate culture, or reform a broken political system, there is no magic spell you can cast. You have to be willing to put in the years, maybe decades, of patient conditioning required to make people understand reason.
It is a sobering realization. The miracle isn't that minced meat flew together. The miracle is the sheer endurance required to change a human mind.
But this brings us to a really harsh reality, which Parwez's analysis doesn't shy away from. You can do the audit, you can point out that the sun sets and the corporate ladder is a fiction, you can try to tame the wild birds with all the patience in the world. But when you audit society's deeply held idols, society usually doesn't thank you. Society attacks.
Which leads us directly to the final and most critical stage of Ibrahim's journey. Ibrahim alone against the entire community. Because the social mechanics of power are highly defensive. When Ibrahim points out the absurdity of the idols, the priests, the elites, and the common people don't suddenly have a collective epiphany and say, wow, great point about entropy, Ibrahim. Let's dismantle our entire culture.
No, they build a fire.
They respond with absolute, overwhelming violence and utter contempt. This is the inevitable sociopolitical backlash when you threaten the structural foundation of a society's power dynamics. The people whose authority, wealth, and identity rely on the idols cannot tolerate the audit.
It's an existential threat to them.
Exactly. So they construct a massive fire, which Parwez reads as both a literal physical threat and a profound metaphor for social hostility to destroy him.
And what does Ibrahim do in the face of this mob? He doesn't beg the idols for mercy. He doesn't recant his scientific observations. He doesn't apologize to the priests. He announces, I am going to my Lord who will guide me.
This is the concept of rational isolation, and I want to emphasize how incredibly difficult this is. It is the absolute ultimate test of the rational order. It is one thing to follow reason when you have a community, like Noah did, building the boat with you. You have social reinforcement.
Yeah, you have your team.
Right. It is entirely another thing to stand completely alone, utterly isolated, while the entire social consensus of your world, maybe even your own family, is screaming that you are wrong. And not just wrong, but a dangerous heretic who needs to be eliminated.
So what makes someone capable of doing that? What makes an individual capable of moving toward an abstract principle, this unseen rational order of the universe, when their entire physical and social environment is literally trying to burn them alive?
It requires a profound, unshakable conviction that the laws of cause and effect are more real and more durable than the temporary rage of the mob. Ibrahim realizes that his current environment is structurally incapable of supporting reason. The society is too toxic. It is too inflamed. The psychological fire is too hot. And here again, Parwez makes his most controversial move. He strips away the mythological reading of the fire.
Right, because the traditional story that everyone learns is that the mob throws Ibrahim into this massive, roaring bonfire, and God magically turns the fire cold. Some traditions even say the flames turned into a garden of roses, and Ibrahim just sat there comfortably enjoying the breeze while his enemies watched in shock.
Which, as we've established, fundamentally violates the core premise of the rational system.
Let me push back one last time on behalf of the traditionalists. If God is the creator of fire, why can't God just temporarily alter the chemical combustion properties of the wood to save his messenger? Why is Parwez so allergic to this miracle?
Because if the universe alters its physical laws to save one person, the entire foundation of human action collapses. If fire suddenly stops burning when a good person is thrown into it, then humans can no longer rely on the laws of thermodynamics.
Everything falls apart.
Exactly. Engineering becomes impossible. Science becomes impossible. The system's deliverance cannot come by suspending physics. Fire burns. That is a physical, universal law. If you stay in the fire, whether you are a messenger or a criminal, your flesh will burn.
So if the fire doesn't magically cool down into a rose garden, how is he delivered? How does the excellent response manifest here?
Deliverance came through Hijra.
Migration.
He leaves.
He just leaves.
He walks away. He preemptively moves away from the irrational mob. He recognizes the physical threat. He audits the environment. He realizes the society cannot be salvaged in that moment. The wild birds refuse to be tamed. And he takes concrete physical action to remove his mass from the radius of the heat.
Wow.
He migrates toward a new geography, a new environment that is conducive to establishing a rational system.
That is so profoundly practical it almost hurts. He didn't sit in the center of the danger, crossing his fingers, waiting for the universe to bend reality around him. He used his legs, he packed his things, he migrated.
He saved himself through action.
Right. The system saved him because the system endowed him with the reasoning to know when a battle is sociologically unwinnable and when it is time to walk away.
Exactly. Waiting for a miracle to violate the laws of physics is a failure to understand the system. Using the laws of physics, moving yourself out of the toxic environment, that is how the system responds excellently. Migration is a rational, mechanical solution to an unsolvable social fire.
Okay, let's bring this all together because over the course of this deep dive, we have looked at two completely different archetypal experiences of the messenger of reason. We have two distinct patterns of response from the universe.
Let's synthesize them. On one hand, you have the archetype of Noah. He audits his society's trajectory, realizes a massive environmental and systemic collapse is coming, and calls out for a solution. He is answered with a physical blueprint, the Ark.
And he has people to help him.
Yes, he acts on it. He manages to gather a reasoning community. They prepare collectively, and their material preservation happens precisely when the crisis hits. They are delivered relatively quickly and decisively by the physical structures they built.
And on the other hand, you have the archetype of Ibrahim. He audits the foundational psychology and power structures of his society. He doesn't have a community. He finds himself completely and utterly isolated.
Very isolated.
He tries to patiently tame the wild birds of his society, but he is met with immediate, violent backlash. His ark isn't a boat he can build in his backyard with a team of friends. His ark is a grueling, solitary, long-distance migration. He has to uproot his entire existence, leave his homeland, and walk into the unknown to find vindication.
But the crucial unifying takeaway from Parwez's analysis is that both individuals are vindicated by the exact same rational system. It is the exact same laws of cause and effect operating in two vastly different sociopolitical contexts.
So, what does this reveal about the timeline of rational vindication? Because clearly it's not a monolith. The universe doesn't operate on a standard, predictable corporate schedule.
It reveals that the system's timeline is entirely dependent on the material conditions on the ground. Sometimes the rational system rewards collective material preparation immediately. If you have the resources and the community to build the dam, you survive the flood the very next day.
But sometimes,
When the rot in the society is so deep, when the idols are so entrenched and the hostility is so absolute, the system requires a long, lonely road. It requires you to uproot your life, endure severe isolation, and slowly, patiently begin the work of taming the wild birds in an entirely new land.
it's a much harder path.
It is. The laws of nature do not promise speed. They do not promise comfort. They only promise inevitability. If you align with reason, you will eventually endure.
That is such a heavy, clarifying thought to process. It completely strips away the romanticism. It's not about magic. It's about raw material reality and the sheer courage required to align with it, whether that means grabbing a hammer to build with your neighbors or packing a bag to walk away from them.
It demands total, uncompromising agency from you. You can never outsource your salvation to the sky.
Which leaves us with a lingering, deeply personal question to throw back to you, the listener, right now. As you go about the rest of your day, think about the systems you're entangled in. Think about your workplace, your relationships, your community, your digital habits.
Audit your own life.
Exactly. If the rational order of the universe responds only to the physical actions we take and the structures we build rather than the words we shout from the roof, what idols in your own life need an immediate audit? What are you submitting to out of fear or habit that is actually completely powerless? And when you look closely at your environment, are you standing in a rising tide, waiting for a miraculous rescue from a toxic situation? Or is the rational system already telling you that it is time to start building a ship or time to migrate?